Well, I didn't used to think of myself primarily as a Muslim American, but let's say before September 11, 2001, it was easier to consider for people to consider themselves Arab American or Persian American or Turkish American. I happen to think of myself as a Tatar American,
Oh.
and the Tatars are the largest Turkic and Muslim minority in Russia. And so, but it's really both funny and sad how after September 11, 2001, whether we like it or not, Muslim Americans become classified as Muslim Americans. So I did grow up in a Muslim family. That was an important part of my identity, but not the only part of my identity. But I think it's become more important over the past years.
In your research, you study Muslims, culture, and many other subjects. What makes you decide to choose Islam and Muslim culture to be your career?
Well, let's say that when I was in high school, for some reason, I thought that I would be interested in studying international relations and then studying international law. I don't know where that came from. Maybe the fact that I grew up in New York, the fact that I was exposed to my own parents' culture and Turkish culture and other things, and of course, we had some affinity with other Muslim cultures and so on. And I also went to a Muslim Sunday school.
After 9/11, there are some people, especially this country, who don't know that much about Islam. They will say, "Oh, it's a violent and backward religion." How would you respond to those people?
Well, there's a lot of different things that I say. First of all, I think that there is a lot of misinformation that's driven by extremist politics in this country, or let's say extreme right-wing politics. Sometimes it's by very, strongly pro-Christian groups and others. And I could give a long academic answer, but the first thing I would say is that none of this is new. I really think that if you read about the histories of Christian attitudes about Muslims from the time of the Prophet Muhammad on, especially beginning in the century or two after his death in 632, you realize that many of the depictions of Muslims was as some kind of misguided offshoot from Christianity, that the Prophet Muhammad was some kind of false prophet, and so on. And some people are familiar with various kinds of academic studies that talk about the history of images of Muslims, and one of the books that goes over that is Edward Said's Orientalism. So the notion in classical times of Muslims as something, as there's being something wrong with Muslims, the way that it might have been that the Prophet Muhammad and others would be depicted by Dante in his Inferno, or other kinds of attitudes that Europeans had about Muslims, those were largely not positive attitudes. And so it's in a way, after 9/11, it seems that a lot of those medieval images and early modern images, which were negative, suddenly went from being very, very deep and underground in Western and European culture and Christian culture to suddenly coming to the surface. And I'll just give one example that I often give when I give lectures about Islam, which I do now after 9/11, if I'm invited to, and where appropriate in my classes, I make sure I have at least one lecture, like in this handout I showed you, where I talk about Islam just to kind of help promote just a neutral understanding of what this religion is about. There used to be a Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, which is actually quite ironic, and who used to talk about the Prophet Muhammad as an idol worshiper. And, the funny thing is that the Prophet Muhammad was telling the story of a single God, and his mission was to end idol worship among Arabians in his time. So just even on the most basic elements, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and people use it for political and other purposes.
There are people who are interested in Islam and want to find out more information, but right now there are tons of websites, a lot of publication, a lot of organization. Sometimes it's very confusing for people to sort out what information source to trust. So for you, when you need to find out what's going on in the Muslim world, what news websites or TV program, or what media sources do you go to find out information?
Well, I'm a little bit of a media junkie, so I can and this changes all the time too. So if this is on a website for a few years, it might be very, very out of date. So in terms of current events about the Muslim world, my favorite, I mean, certainly in terms of the Middle East and South Asia, my favorite website is by Professor Juan Cole at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, and so that's basically www.juancole.com. It's a blog called Informed Comment. There's lots of different news sites too, but what he does is he, links and has critical commentary about all kinds of sources and all kinds of misinformation. So, in fact, very often, when I do a small bi-weekly course with the international learning community, we often look to that and find information that he links to an article. So that's just, if there's going to be one single source that somebody reads every day, that's pretty good. One of the very, very controversial news services is Al Jazeera, and I should just say that at home, because I get satellite TV, I get, one of the channels I get is Al Jazeera in English. I wish I got it in Arabic too. But I find consistently, and I've even seen letters to the New York Times saying this, that this is one of the best news services in the world. It's not without its faults, but I can say that, I've seen extensive coverage of earthquakes in Latin America, when there was the war between Georgia and Russia. It was by far the best news service, and it was demonized for a long time. And I think when people began to take it seriously was during Israel's Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, where Al Jazeera had the only journalists on the ground, and it was embarrassing for the rest of the world media to be ignoring Al Jazeera. And then finally NPR and CNN and others began to interview the Al Jazeera correspondents on the ground. So, and I've heard that there may be like one cable station in Vermont or something that carries it. Recently, the news director of Al Jazeera was given a visa and visited Washington, so maybe it might appear on more cable stations. But really, it has extensive coverage, and it's really a great source of information, not just about the Middle East, but about the world in general from a different perspective.
So if people don't have access to the TV program, you recommend they can check out their website?
Their website, too. And in fact, I'm still shocked that I may be one of the few people in the United States who has ready access to it. And for one of my retired colleagues from my department, he became aware of that station while traveling in the Middle East and in Turkey. And I set up a satellite for him just so that he could watch that news channel. It was that impressive for him. And so I do notice that Professor Juan Cole and others, they regularly link to video clips from their website. So that's another way of getting information from them.
So there are video clips, say, on the YouTube?
No, on the AlJazeera.net website.
Okay. So if you have only 3 words to describe Islam, what would they be for you?
Well, I indicated to you that on a handout I use for classes, I just say diversity, diversity, diversity. Because Islam is not a monolith. You can't talk about it as a single religion that has only single characteristics. There are people, let's say, Wahhabis and Salafis and so on. So let's say the official doctrine of Saudi Arabia's Wahhabism, where they think that they know what the only correct brand of Islam is. But in reality, if you think about history, if you think about the diversity of Muslim beliefs and practices on the local, culturally specific level, you can't really paint Muslims with a single brush.